Kynaios and Tiro of Meletis, KNT for short, is a commander most often associated with group hug strategies. But in this deck, hugging is the last thing on the agenda. I prefer to call this a group hate deck, because its primary goal is to grind your opponent's will to play into the dirt. At a glance, KNT's ability seems generous. At the end of your turn, each opponent can either draw a card or put a land into play, while you get to do both. This creates a subtle, long-term advantage where you gradually pull ahead, advancing on either lands or cards against your opponents. Now, this deck wants to win, but it doesn't try to win outright. If you're a fan of Star Trek The Next Generation, you might recall the episode Stratagem, where victory wasn't about overt aggression, but about not losing until your opponent quits out of frustration. That's the philosophy here. Don't die, and the game will eventually fall into your lap. To support this, I've packed in the best I Don't Die cards available: Teferi's Protection, The One Ring, Everybody Lives, and Angel's Grace. Next are the fog effects to stall combat damage: Obscuring Haze, Comeuppance, and Mandate of Peace. I even run some creative alternatives like Equal Treatment, a cantrip that makes all damage equal to 2. Unlike traditional fogs, it doesn't prevent damage, which lets it bypass cards like Questing Beasts that ignore prevention effects. For combat trickery, there's Illusionist Gambit and Windshaper Planetar, which let me redirect attackers, and Chronomantic Escape, a suspend card which recasts itself and prevents me from getting attacked every 4 turns. Then there's the Goad package: Disrupt Decorum, Bothersome Quasate, Geode Rager, and the Sound of Drums. I especially love the Sound of Drums for its ability to turn an opponent's commander into a deadly threat against everyone but me. Its recursion effect adds even more value, ensuring I don't fall behind on cards even if the enchanted creature dies. Of course, I've got the classic taxing enchantments: Propaganda, Ghostly Prison, and Collective Restraint. The latter is especially potent in this 4-color deck since its cost scales with the number of land types I control, usually 4, but maybe 5 if someone has an Urborg out. Last on the list are defensive cards, which can also help me end the game: Reins of Power, Deflecting Palm, and Selfless Squire. Deflecting Palm doesn't target, so it works well against Voltron commanders that normally can't be targeted. Reins of Power lets me steal my opponent's creatures to swing for lethal, and Selfless Squire can easily come down as a 40/40 and then swing back to kill one of my opponents. It's also worth noting Selfless Squire gets bigger anytime damage is prevented, so if I use any fog effects after he's entered the field, he'll continue to grow. The aforementioned damage prevention effects are the core component of this deck. Now let's move on and look at the rest of the deck. For game finishers, I rely on cards like Insurrection and Mob Rule. Since I don't run removal and instead opt to fog my way out of combat situations, there's always a lot of good creatures on the board for me to steal. Another favorite is Treacherous Terrain, which deals combat damage to opponents equal to the number of lands they control. Thanks to my accelerating my opponents, as well as me forcing them to attack each other with the various Goad effects, this can easily deliver a lethal blow. But the crown jewel of this deck, the card that originally drove me to build it, is Divine Intervention. The enchantment enters the battlefield with 2 counters, and at the beginning of each upkeep, you remove a counter. When the last counter is removed, the game ends in a draw. That's right, a draw. No winners, no losers, just an abrupt and dramatic halt. The history of Divine Intervention is that it was designed during the anti-era of Magic, where players could actually lose their physical cards. A draw meant no one would lose their ante. Nowadays, though, it's just a salt factory. Seriously, people hate it, maybe even more than you win the game cards like Felidar Sovereign. Because of this, I included Fractured Identity, which allows me to exile Divine Intervention and give each opponent a copy. That way, everyone can have their own salt factory. And honestly, Fractured Identity is just fun. Using it on a Praetor or Eldrazi means everyone but the person who cast Kozilek gets to have one. To keep myself alive without using cards, I've also loaded the deck with maze effects: Corehaven, Maze of Ith, Labyrinth of Skophos, Mystifying Maze, and Prav Spires of Order. Among these, Prav stands out because it doesn't use the word target, allowing it to bypass Hexproof, Shroud, and Protection. Plus, it can prevent any kind of damage, whether it's from creatures, spells, or even a planeswalker emblem. One of my favorite interactions with my mazes is with Radiant Performer, which copies a single target spell or ability for every other valid target. Imagine using Maze of Ith on 20 attacking creatures, or copying an opponent's Strip Mine activation to turn their Strip Mine into an Armageddon. And potentially I'll protect my board with Boros Charm or Teferi's Protection, turning it into an asymmetric effect. To further safeguard my lands, I run Teferi's Response and Pyramids. Teferi's Response is a highly specific but extremely efficient counterspell that not only protects a land against a spell or ability, but also draws me 2 cards, all for just 2 mana. Pyramids might not be the most efficient card, but I like the art, and its ability to remove enchantments from lands is surprisingly relevant, such as when freeing a permanent enchanted by Song of the Dryads. For ramp, I mostly focus on 2 mana spells. Nature's Lore, 3 visits, Farseek, Explore, Growth Spiral, and Arcane Signet ensure I can reliably hit 4 mana by turn 3. I also have cards like Deep Gnome Terramancer, Smothering Tithe, Tadiova, and Shattered Angel, which synergize perfectly with K&T's ability. It's worth noting I also run Time Spiral, because all the super annoying cards in this deck are worth shuffling back into my library for another round of super fun magic. As for the mana base, I prioritize bounce lands, which let me return a land to my hand and then replay it using K&T's ability. I also run Triomes, Checklands, Shocklands, and Yavimaya Cradle of Growth, which turns my maze effects into green mana sources. If you enjoy playing a deck that leaves your opponents groaning and muttering, "How does that deck even win?" then this is the deck for you. It commits very few permanents to the board, and instead depends on a highly reactive strategy based on goading your opponent's creatures and leaving mana up for fog effects. With enough patience, you'll eventually develop enough resources to get Divine Intervention off. And when that happens, you get to throw your hands up and say, "Ah, that's too bad. The game's a draw. I guess no one won tonight."